The streets of Washington are silent. Then sirens cut the air, power grids crash, and news alerts flash that U.S. bases have been hit. It sounds impossible. Yet here is the question that matters. What could ever bring war to American soil? For over 2 centuries, war has stayed far from American soil. 2 oceans, unmatched military power, and a global network of allies have made the United States feel untouchable. And today, war on U.S. soil still seems unthinkable, and it should. But history shows something uncomfortable. Every great power that believed it was safe at home eventually faced conflict on its own territory. No major power wants to invade the U.S. today, but wars do not always start because someone wants them. They start when pressures erase old limits. This video will explore what conditions could actually bring a war to U.S. soil, who might push it, what it would take to overcome America's defenses, and how the government and the public would respond if it ever happened. This is not alarmism, it is analysis. Because thinking about the unthinkable is how you prevent it. If you want to understand what it would take for war to cross the oceans and reach the United States, stay with us. And if you find value in analysis like this, subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. Because before we can understand how war might come here, we have to understand why it has stayed away for so long. For most of modern history, the United States has lived behind 2 vast oceans, and that geography has shaped its sense of security. Any enemy would have to cross thousands of miles of open water under constant satellite surveillance just to reach American shores. That distance has always felt like an invisible wall. Power reinforced it. According to the Department of Defense, the U.S. spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, fields 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and operates over 700 overseas bases built to keep threats far from home. It also holds the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal, a shield that promises massive retaliation to anyone who tries a full-scale invasion. These are the hard facts that make America feel untouchable. But feeling safe is not the same as being safe. The same global reach that protects the U.S. also stretches it thin. The same high-tech networks that power its forces are themselves targets. Analysts at RAND and CSIS warn that cyber attacks could paralyze command systems, satellites, and logistics hubs before a single missile is launched. The economy is another pressure point. America's supply chains run through fragile choke points abroad, and even a limited disruption could freeze critical industries at home. And unlike during the Cold War, today's information ecosystem can turn confusion into panic in seconds. This is the paradox. U.S. power is real, but its edges are fragile. That is why war on American soil still seems impossible, yet no longer unthinkable. And that leaves one question hanging in the air. What mix of pressure, miscalculation, and ambition could ever break through that shield? Because if America's defenses ever fail, they will not fail from the outside first, they will fail from the inside. If war ever reached American soil, it would not start with landing craft on a beach. It would start with pressure cracking the political core of the country. The first spark would be a major war with another great power. A clash with China in the Pacific or with Russia in Europe would pull American forces to the edges of the map. If both erupted at once, Washington would face the nightmare its own planners call the 2-war trap. It would be forced to split its strength across 2 oceans while defending a homeland that has not seen combat in generations. That strain would not stay on the battlefields. It would flow back through Congress, through Wall Street, through the living rooms of American families. Mobilization needs money, coordination, and speed. A deeply polarized Congress could stall emergency funding, argue over deployments, and let days slip away while the Pentagon burns hours it cannot spare. History shows what that looks like. In 1941, Washington believed Japan could not strike Hawaii. In 1950, it believed North Korea would not cross the 38th parallel. Both times, complacency bought the enemy time. The same pattern could repeat, only faster. A slow response would not just delay action, it would invite risk. Because deterrence depends on perception. It works only if enemies believe the U.S. will react instantly and overwhelmingly. If Washington looks hesitant or divided, if its commitments seem hollow, the fear that has kept war away could break. Rivals would see opportunity, not danger. And war does not wait for votes. It erupts when pressure outweighs fear. The real danger is not that America would suddenly become weak, but that it might look slow. And the moment it looks slow, someone will start wondering if striking first is worth the risk. Because once the political core begins to crack, the question is no longer if someone would try, but who would dare. If war ever came to American soil, it would not happen because someone dreamed of planting their flag in Washington. It would happen because someone felt they had nothing left to lose. Russia is the first shadow on that horizon. The Kremlin would never choose a direct war with the United States while it still had other options. But if its regime were collapsing under battlefield defeats, crippling sanctions, and internal unrest, the calculus could change. In a desperate corner, Moscow could see a limited strike on U.S. soil as the last card to force Washington to the table, a shock meant to freeze escalation and save the state from disintegration. History offers echoes of this logic. In 1941, Imperial Japan struck Pearl Harbor not because it expected to win a total war, but because its leaders feared slow strangulation. Desperation breeds risk. China would come from a different place, but could reach the same edge. Beijing does not want war with the United States, yet if it faced a total economic blockade or watched its attempt to take Taiwan collapse in blood and failure, the fear of national humiliation could outweigh restraint. A sharp, symbolic strike on American soil could be framed as a way to break U.S. willpower without triggering all-out war, a lightning shock to buy space for survival. Chinese doctrine calls this shock warfare, using speed and surprise to paralyze the enemy before they mobilize. If Beijing ever crossed that line, it would be because it saw the alternative as political death. Iran and North Korea would move from another angle entirely. They know they cannot win a full war, but they could act as spoilers, striking while America is already stretched thin elsewhere. A missile from Pyongyang or a covert strike from Tehran-backed forces would not aim to conquer, but to divide, draining U.S. attention and forcing Washington to fight on one more front. And behind these states are their shadows, the proxies. Non-state actors armed and directed by hostile powers could hit U.S. infrastructure, airports, or power grids, creating chaos without clear fingerprints, blurring the line between terrorism and war. None of these actors want a long campaign on U.S. soil. They would not seek to hold territory. They would aim for shock, disruption, and panic, hoping that fear inside America becomes stronger than resolve. Because if fear wins, even a single strike could achieve what no invasion ever could. Make the United States doubt its own invulnerability. And once that doubt takes root, it spreads faster than any missile. Which is exactly why the next question matters even more. If one of these actors ever decided to take the risk, how would that war actually reach American soil? If a war ever reached American soil, it would not arrive with flags and marching soldiers. It would arrive as silence, then confusion, then shock. The first strike would be invisible. Cyber attacks would tear through the digital nervous system that keeps the country alive, freezing power grids, shutting down water treatment plants, collapsing hospital networks, and halting freight rail lines. Analysts at RAND warn that just a handful of coordinated attacks on high-voltage substations could trigger cascading blackouts from coast to coast, blackouts that would last not hours, but weeks. While the lights go out, the real blows would fall from the sky. Hypersonic missiles, moving at over 5 times the speed of sound, could slam into U.S. bases in Alaska, Guam, or Hawaii before Washington even confirmed they were in the air, tearing open the forward shields that guard the Pacific approaches. And if those strikes landed, the next targets would be the arteries of American power. Ports like Long Beach, Houston, and Norfolk could be crippled by precision strikes or underwater sabotage, severing both military resupply and commercial lifelines in the same instant. Cargo would stop moving, fuel would stop flowing, and the war would move inside. While the country stared at the skies, small teams could move quietly on the ground. Infiltrated operatives or local proxies might sabotage rail hubs, fuel depots, or data centers, lighting fires across the map faster than the government could put them out. Even space would not be safe. According to U.S. Space Command, America relies on over 400 satellites for communication, navigation, and early warning. Destroying even a few could blind the military, silence air traffic control, and plunge daily life into chaos. No single strike would conquer the United States. That would not be the point. The point would be paralysis. Confuse the command structure, cripple the economy, flood the information space with panic, and make the government seem unable to protect its own people. Because once that perception takes hold, victory does not require conquering territory. It only requires convincing millions of Americans that the war is already lost before it truly begins. And if that perception spread, the next move would fall not to the attackers, but to Washington. Because at that point, survival would depend on how fast the U.S. government could restore order before the public lost faith completely. The first reaction would be shock, and the second would be control. If war ever reached American soil, the federal government would move to reassert authority before panic could spread faster than the attack itself. According to the Department of Homeland Security, contingency plans already exist for localized martial law, allowing the president to deploy federal troops to secure critical infrastructure and enforce emergency orders. Borders would close almost immediately, both to stop infiltration and to keep supply routes stable, and the National Guard would be mobilized to defend power grids, ports, and data centers. At the same time, Washington would race to contain the digital battlefield. Cybersecurity directives from the Pentagon describe rapid isolation of compromised networks, rerouting military communications through hardened systems, and cutting sections of the civilian internet if needed to halt cascading failures. Civil liberties would narrow fast. Travel restrictions, curfews, and information controls would become normal overnight, not as long-term policy, but as triage to preserve order. The White House would also need to win the psychological war. After the September 11th attacks, studies showed that fear and confusion did more to paralyze the economy than physical damage. That is why the government would flood the airwaves with constant briefings trying to keep public trust from collapsing. Yet even if it worked, the trade-offs would be immense. Every hour spent restoring calm would be an hour not spent striking back. Every restriction would risk public backlash if it felt like overreach. And every step toward control would test the same democratic system it is meant to defend. The paradox is brutal. To survive a war on its own soil, the United States would have to act more like a fortress than a democracy, at least for a while. The real question is how long Americans would accept that before resistance at home becomes as dangerous as the enemy outside. For ordinary Americans, the first shock would not be missiles or soldiers. It would be silence. Lights going out, phones dead, grocery shelves empty, and no clear answers about what comes next. Modern life depends on invisible networks, and war would strike them first. Cyber attacks could cripple the electrical grid, knock out banking systems, and freeze supply chains in place. According to the Department of Energy, a blackout lasting just days could halt fuel deliveries, disable water treatment, and send food prices soaring within hours. Panic would spread faster than the physical damage. Stock markets would crash on rumor alone. Credit cards would stop working, and local economies would revert to cash as trust evaporates. The government might order rationing, but moving supplies through disrupted ports and highways would be slow, and patience would run out faster than trucks could arrive. Even daily routines would collapse. Schools would close, workplaces would shutter, and millions would be told to shelter indoors as officials try to identify which cities are safe. The psychological toll could be just as destructive as any physical attack. Studies after September 11th showed that fear and misinformation caused more disruption than the attacks themselves, and in a war on U.S. soil, that effect would be magnified. Social media would turn into a battlefield of false alarms and foreign propaganda, and citizens would struggle to tell real orders from fabricated ones. Meanwhile, the draft could return. If American forces were tied down overseas while defending at home, Congress could authorize emergency conscription to fill the gap, pulling young men and women out of civilian life overnight. That would redraw the social fabric in ways few people alive today can imagine. The comfort that defines American life would vanish almost instantly, replaced by curfews, checkpoints, and the constant hum of fear. And this is where the story becomes personal, because once the war touches daily life, every American becomes part of the front line, whether they want to be or not. And if that day ever came, the real battle would not be just about survival. It would be about holding on to the idea of America while living through its darkest hour. What makes this conversation urgent is not a sudden rise in the odds of invasion, it is the slow shift in how wars begin and how societies break. For decades, America relied on distance, on deterrence, and on the idea that the home front is separate from the front line. But that boundary has thinned. Rivals test under the threshold. Cyber attacks scan for weak seams. Information campaigns try to turn panic into policy, and all of it happens before a single missile flies. According to Rand, modern coercion favors pressure that avoids clear red lines. And that is exactly where the United States is most exposed, not in tanks and ships, but in time, in perception, in cohesion. The distance that once protected America can now delay its decisions. While an adversary uses hours of confusion to create facts on the ground, that is the distance trap. Power remains real, but the clock can beat it, and the clock is what smart rivals will try to control. This is why every thread we have pulled in this video ties back to the same fabric. Great power strain abroad stretches readiness at home. Polarization slows clear choices. Gray zone attacks bypass classic defenses, and the first casualty becomes public trust. Once trust wobbles, markets seize, supply chains jam, and fear amplifies damage far beyond the blast radius. The lesson is not to live in fear. It is to remove the incentives for a rival to gamble. Resilience lowers those incentives. Deterrence that is credible and fast lowers them even more, and unity lowers them most of all. None of this requires panic. It requires clarity. Hardening. The grid is boring until the lights go out. Rehearsing crisis communication is dull until rumors move faster than orders. Aligning allies looks tedious until a test hits two regions at once. Prevention is not drama, it is discipline. The United States does not need to match every provocation with spectacle. But it does need to close the windows that make spectacle tempting. Because a rival will not ask whether America is strong, they will ask whether it is confident, whether it is quick, whether it is together. That is the fork in the road we face now, and it leads to a final question that matters more than probabilities. Are we willing to do the quiet work that keeps a distant war from becoming a local one? Or do we wait for the first night when the silence breaks? If a war ever reached American soil, it would not begin with an armada on the horizon. It would begin as confusion, as silence, as a sudden gap between what leaders believe and what reality demands. That is what makes this question worth asking. Because the real risk is not that America is weak, it is that it assumes it will always have time. History shows that great powers fall when they trust distance more than discipline, when they mistake strength for invulnerability. The United States still holds unmatched power, but power only protects if it moves fast, stays united, and knows what it is defending. This video was not about predicting an invasion. It was about exposing the seams that make one imaginable. And if we can see those seams now, we can close them before someone else tries to pull them apart. Because the true line between peace and war is not on a map. It is in preparation. It is in choices. It is in how seriously we treat the quiet moments before the sirens ever sound. So what do you think? Would the United States be ready if war ever came home? Or has its own sense of safety become its greatest vulnerability? Tell us in the comments. And if this video gave you a new way to see America's defenses, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.